What we can do now, it's Q&A. Paulo, would you like to finish your remarks, or would you like to say something there?
No, Pablo, we can go to move on Q&As, no problem. I was just talking about our farm level extension project, so I can talk if someone is interested with, no problem.
That's pretty good, Paulo. What I'll do is, well, Anita Fleming was chairing your session, so I would encourage Anita to ask some questions there, because what you're doing is some of the things that we are doing here at Lincoln as well. Fred, are you online there? No, obviously, maybe Fred's still having issues. Lynn, are you there?
Yes, I am here. And
good, good. Tom. So I would again, as you can imagine, you know, we are all learning in these sort of things, so we'll learn as we go. So I'll ask Tom and Anita to quickly summarize your sessions, and then we open to the whole room.
Anita, I'll go first. So thank you, Lynn, for a very entertaining and enlightening talk. Lots of great photographs there, but in a nutshell, Dr. Lynn Hunsinger was sharing experiences, retrospective, historical perspective, and looking forward in California and what's happened ecologically on the ground, literally with regards change from open, clear forest to crowding due to a change in either it's the geopolitics coming in, mixing with biophysical ecology there, Lynn, but essentially care of the land that was happening naturally with native peoples and ranches until about 1900 being stopped, you know, healthy burning, keeping, as you said, Lynn, burning by native people after the fall, autumn hunting, and then that happening almost every year, very frequently, keeping things healthy, the undergrowth healthy, and light coming in, native California grasslands. But that's all changed with the advent of, let's put it fairly, colonialism and different people coming in. And a sudden change now, perhaps a better appreciation of the value of prescribed burning and well-managed landscapes using fire. And so the funding coming in for fire prevention is starting to come up, even though the funding is much higher for stopping a fire when it actually starts. So you had some very, Lynn, if you just perhaps, because we got cut off there, you had some pretty pertinent questions that would lend itself to a really neat discussion in this Q&A. Would you like to just share those very quickly, please?
Sure. Okay, yeah, sure. I'm happy to do that. One of the questions I was asking is, prescribed burning is great. We don't do very much of it. We do less than 40,000 hectares of prescribed burning a year in California, and that's come up because the agencies have not been very willing to let people burn, just agencies. But they're trying to improve that. But my point is, we remove almost 6 billion tons of vegetation through cattle grazing in California. And using grazing could really improve our forest and grassland and woodland health by preventing fire and keeping things open. So that was one of my pet peeves, is that we never hear about grazing as a methodology. Instead, we're doing relatively expensive and somewhat difficult things, and they could be together. They can help each other. Fire and grazing have always been partners, but why not now? So I had a couple questions. The most widespread vegetation management program in California is grazing by cattle. Why is it neglected in the press and policy? And I showed our big wildfire resilience plan for the state that actually has a picture of cattle grazing under one of these very dangerous power lines, but never mentions grazing or livestock in the entire document. It's all about prescribed burning, which I favor, but it's not enough. It's not going to be enough. can we graze purposely for fire hazard management and produce food? Because right now, cattle grazing is somewhat incidental. It's the fire hazard reduction takes place kind of incidentally because we're actually creating animal products and food. It's a foodscape, but it's actually a fire reduction scape too. And if we made grazing a little more purposefully with incentives or just better planning or working with fire models, we could do a lot more with grazing. And it's not nearly as expensive as some of the other treatments. And then, except for wildfire is very cheap. And we have had our wildfires in 2020 were more than twice as many, maybe 3 times as many as we've ever had before in extent. And then I did some history in this talk. I'm fascinated by it. And I started to wonder if all over the world, if people who do subsistence in forests don't try to open the canopy up more. If that's just not, I mean, people need light, plants need light, game needs light. Is this true all over the world? And is it just in temperate forests? I know in the tropics we have Sweden. What else? I was just interested in that. Thanks.
Thanks, Lynn.
Sure.
Fantastic. Anita, would you like to summarize or point out key points of Paulo's and Susie's talk?
Dr. Suzanne Vita from Rhodes University went first on her discussion of integrated farm systems to reduce carbon emissions. And so she talked about how rangelands are actually a really large portion of the global landscape, so about 50%. And of that 50%, about, I think, 40% are comprised of grassy biomes. And unfortunately, one of the ways that we're trying to reduce carbon emissions, I guess, is by planting large-scale plantations. And I know this is something that we've definitely encountered in New Zealand, particularly with pine. And unfortunately, that reduces the biodiversity of the system, as well as, system resilience and productivity of those landscapes. So yeah, she provided a really interesting discussion on some of the problems that people are facing and the need to sort of tailor more specialized systems, I guess, in plantations that better meet local contexts. We also had a talk from Professor Paulo Carvalho. Unfortunately, he was cut off, and he has done some really interesting work regarding different grazing management strategies and integrated livestock systems to improve system resilience as well as yields. And I did have one question for Paulo. Sort of leads on to, I think, the end of his discussion that got caught off, so it might be good for him to sort of speak on it a little bit. But I just wondered how the different grazing managements that were implemented at the farm level, how that improved farm profit in production and livestock yield. Paulo, would you be able to comment on that?
Yes, thanks, Anita. Well, I stressed that the grazing intensity was much more important than the grazing method. So this is the point when we work with farmers and we try to implement sound grazing management by controlling grazing intensity indirectly by targeting sward heights. So it's not it's not related to stocking methods. We can do it with rotational stocking or continuous stocking. The main point is the grazing intensity. So sward high is the main target that we work with directly with farmers.
Lynn, it's specifically to you, and a very interesting talk, and thanks for the slides. It's really that, for me, it's about Groundhog Day, because I don't know if we have any people here from Southern Europe. Southern Europe has been through for many, many years cataclysmic fires that have been caused by particularly depopulation of farming landscapes. So people left when farming was no longer profitable, went into the big cities, fire built up, massive fires that damaged property, people, and landscapes. I know in France, for example, they had to reinstate grazing into these landscapes and took on people who had never had the experience of grazing to create open landscapes and reduce the fire mass. And that was, those people had to be handheld through how to manage grazing. But ultimately, it reduced the biomass in many years and reduce the risk of forest fire. Are you getting the similar situation in California where people are leaving these systems because of issues of profitability or even fear of damage to property and life? And if so, how do you think California will go about reinstating grazing into these landscapes, which haven't had it for over 100 years?
It's a really interesting question and a really important one. And I want to tell you that I've been inspired by some of the projects in Europe. There's, big projects in Valencia in Spain, and communities trying to sort of reclaim their land. And one interesting thing I learned is that this community in Portugal, one of the things they said is they had to somehow make sure that the land around their community did not get classified as forest, because then they wouldn't be allowed to manipulate it. And also another friend of mine talks about fuel breaks, using agriculture to break up continuous fuels, and that includes orchards and grazing. Well, that is just not happening in California. It is just not happening. And I think the biggest case of neither is land abandonment. And in fact, what we're seeing is people moving into the forest, just assuming that to protect them. So we have this opposite problem. And I've thought about land abandonment and what's the parallel in California. And some friends and I published a little art about this in Science a few years ago, from when I was in Spain for sabbatical. And the land abandonment in California is the public lands, the lands that were reserved by the federal government. They don't have the capacity for political and also financial reasons to manage. They own half of California, and they don't, people who live near the public forests are scared because they can't do anything to the forest because of the government, but they at the same time are terrified because these trees are coming right up to their houses. Actually, I interviewed a person. We moved out here, we thought it was beautiful, we wanted to protect every tree. Now we want to get rid of about 2/3 of them. After you've lived there for a while and you start to get scared, but they're not leaving so much. At least it takes a few years for them to decide to leave. And I heard, I mentioned cultural burning, Native American burning in my talk. And there's a guy, Ron Good. He's a tribal chairman in Middle California, and he got permission from the government, the Forest Service, to do some meadow enhancement, which means removing young trees and clearing the meadows and doing burning or clearing they can do to get back the meadows that used to provide the sustenance for Native American groups. Some ranchers came by and said, "What are you doing?" And they said, "We're trying to meadow, we're doing a cultural burning and cultural management of the vegetation." And they said, "Well, we've been trying to get this done by the Forest Service for 30 years. How can we help?" And they wound up giving the tribe money to help them do more of it because they couldn't get permission, So it's just been, that's the kind of land abandonment we have. People are still moving out into the countryside. Our landscapes are being fragmented and becoming more dangerous. It's probably declined a little bit, except I would have said that, but with the pandemic, a lot of people have moved out of town. So we're not seeing that same kind of land abandonment in most of California that you're describing in Europe, but we have half of the state is abandoned public land. National Park Yosemite, which has been burning for 100 years still doing prescribed burning, and it's a different world. So I hope that sort of answered your question, Ian.
That's really good, Ian. Stefan, you just raised your hand.
Question for Dr. Carvalho, which was an excellent presentation. Thank you for that. I have two short questions, really. The first one being, what are the main barriers to reintegrating animals and crops? Because here, for instance, in the US, I believe you cannot really get crop insurance if you graze animals. So what are some of the ways that we can perhaps break down these barriers, in your opinion? And then my second quick question is, have you studied the impact of integrated systems on the nutrient density versus maybe more monoculture systems where animals and cropping systems are decoupled?
Yeah, thank you for your question. Well, regarding the first one, could you repeat, please, the first one?
Yeah, what are the main barriers to reintegration of crop and livestock, and how do we potentially break down these barriers, in your opinion?
Okay, well, one of the barriers I would say is we have many, but one is the advisors. They are much more specialized than they should be. So there is a general trend of specialization, not only at farm level, but at academic level as well, I would say. So, for example, in faculties in Brazil, only in 13% of the faculties you can learn about integrated crop livestock systems. So this is just one point. We consider an important barrier. A second important barrier, I would say, is the commercial environment. And the small farmers, they think now that the only way to stay to keep the farm is to increase yield, and to increase yield by increasing silage and concentrates. So the trend in the specialization for these small farms is very hard, pushing them to a compost barn and freestall systems. So we consider that an important barrier. So on average, when we work with farmers and we start that extension program that I could not explain, cows have about 60 to 70% of their diet on silage and concentrate. And this is for southern Brazil is quite unusual, because we have a lot of temperate and tropical pastures as well. So what we try to do with those farmers is to reverse this trend and reintegrate I would say forages in the diet of those cows. No? So, but anyway, it's difficult because they think that, or they go to intense systems, or they will perish.
That's good.
And in pastures, they think that pasture is something like a middle age. Again, you know. So we'd say two important barriers, I would say.
That's good, Paula. We got time for one more question. Is there any comment or question? Yeah, Max.
Yeah, thanks, Pablo. I had a question for Lynn, and you just touched on this very briefly. Excellent talk too, thank you. It was the point about the non-native grasses. In other words, the invasion of these species, as you said, I think, tripled the fire frequency. So is anything being done about that? Like, for example, introduction of insects that might target them or something? I don't know.
No. And yes and no. So I'm a range manager. I studied grass. I study the native grasses, and we find that they do well on certain kinds of indigenous soils, like serpentine and some other soils, very bad soil. Nitrogen deposition by cars, for example, strictly benefits the non-natives. And so we also accept that we can't get rid of them. We can reduce them. It's a novel ecosystem is what we call it. And we can reduce the biomass, which is the cause of most of the effects, fire and smothering habitat and smothering native grass with cattle or sheep, because they remove it. And so it's been found to be quite beneficial to some species of wildlife, including a lot of endangered species, and to fire hazard reduction. But I don't think we will see any mass restoration of the native grassland, but we do have good native grassland in many areas, and mixed in with that grass are native species. They're still there, and in fact with this drought there's more of them than ever because the non-native grasses couldn't grow so much. It's really amazing. I've got them right in my backyard. So there are, however, people who really feel that they're going to do stuff to the non-natives, and I saw one or get rid of the non-natives, and I saw a recent talk where they basically used napalm year after year trying to kill them off. The problem is that they're very prolific seed producers. There's a decade or two of soils in the ground. Sometimes they've tried to dig out a yard deep of the soil and get rid of it and put some kind of new soil in there. That is not going to happen on a large scale, and some people want to irrigate. So patch by patch, you can take the actions necessary to reduce the non-natives, but on a landscape scale, we have to live with them. And grazing is a darn good way. They're good forage, most of them, not all of them. Grazing is a darn good way to live with them. We also use prescribed burning to manipulate non-native species, especially some of the noxious. But
Okay, thank you.
Any insect that would eat that stuff would probably eat us too.
I really like your answer, Lena.